Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a video doing a how I would adapt a series. This time for Kevin J. Anderson's, as he calls it, his magnum opus, his Saga of the Seven Sons. I have displayed some of his books up here this time. I wanted to try that out. And I'm going to talk about, where I think that how you could adapt it, movie or television, which studio I think would be better suited to it, which showrunners, budgets, casting, that type of stuff. And so I'm going to talk about all that in this video. If you have an opinion on how you would adapt it, let me know down in the comments section. I'd love to have a chat about this. This isn't exactly the most widely read series, but it's got its readers, which is why I think it could be successful. And it's very, I think, easily accessible to new audiences, especially in a visual format, because I think Kevin writes that way. So let's begin with how I would do it, movie or TV series. I think the obvious answer, when you look at the size of these books, you cannot do movies and do justice to the characters. There are dozens, if not probably hundreds, of named important characters in this series that come in and out of the different books, and they have huge plot lines and huge character development that you cannot just distill it down into a 2-hour movie. There are some science fiction novels that you can do that, or distill it down into like 2 movies maybe. This is a book series that has to be a television series. It has to be adapted to television. Also, that means that you can keep the budget lower. You can afford to spend $200 million on the first season of on the first movie, but you might be able to spend $80 million or $70 million making a TV show out of it, which I think would be much more profitable. So let's start going through how I would do it, starting with where. You have to have the right place for this. And I have 3 suggestions. Each of them have pros behind them. Each of them have cons. So the first place I'm going to talk about is HBO Max, or as it's now unfortunately called, Max. Max, I think, is the best place for this for a couple of reasons. The world building, the politics, the action of the Saga of the Seven Sons, and even the pacing of the books most reminds me and is most similar to HBO's show, the Game of Thrones, based off the A Song of Ice and Fire books. And I think that because they had great success with that series, although not at the end of the series, but they had great success with that series, adapting it, I think that HBO then going to Max for streaming would be the right destination for this. There are some problems, though. HBO and Warner Brothers has been kind of strapped for cash lately. They have had some difficulties holding on to their properties and handling their properties well, so they might not be the best place in terms of at the moment. But years down the line, when they get their act together, maybe they will be the right place. Here are the other suggestions I have. Paramount Plus understands how to make sci-fi series, and they know how to do them on a grand scale. Just look at all their Star Trek stuff. Here's the problem with Paramount Plus. They're struggling with viewership and with ratings and with getting enough subscribers. And then they also have just made some poor decisions on the creative side and on the business side recently, which does not give me the confidence that Paramount Plus could handle this. So they have some negatives, but they're not the strongest negatives. They also have some positives that just aren't the strongest positives. There is a third streaming service that I think could make this as a TV show, and that is Apple TV Plus. The reason I think they can is because they have a fantastic track record producing great science fiction television. For All Mankind, one of the best science fiction shows out there. You have Silo, which just released and got huge audience numbers and really was popular. And then you also have the show Foundation, which I haven't watched, but a lot of people talk about. And so Apple TV Plus knows how to do sci-fi. My fear, though, with Apple TV Plus is they have too much sci-fi that it just would get lost in the mix, and Apple TV Plus's audience is really small. Now, Apple is probably okay taking loss of money because of how powerful they are, and they're thinking about the long game, so they probably could afford to produce a series that's going to get lost in the shuffle temporarily. But I think that they would be my third choice. My first choice is HBO going to Max, and then my second choice would be Paramount, and my third choice would be Apple TV. So that's the studio. Thing about showrunners, this was a really, really hard thing to think about. Who would I get to showrun this series? I have a couple of answers. I'm just not sure if they would do it. First of all, I would want the showrunner to be a fan of the series, which is kind of hard because it's not the most well-read series. And I don't know all the showrunners or any showrunners who have read the series. So my number one pick, I don't know because I don't know people who have read the series. But let's take that aspect out of it. Just think, who are good showrunners, people who handle television shows well? Well, I have a couple of answers. One is the showrunner Ryan Condal, most known for working for HBO on House of the Dragon. Now, he's got a couple other fantasy projects that are George R.R. Martin related, but I think that, down the line, especially if they started this after they finished up House of the Dragon, this would be a good series for him. He understands politics, he understands high concept, he understands budgets, he understands great storytelling, and he's good at adapting George Martin's stuff, and so I think he could adapt this. That's my number one answer, aside from someone who's already a fan of the series. And if he is, well, that's perfect. The second person I have is Terry Matalas, and purely because he did such a good job on Picard Season 3, and apparently I've been told his 12 Monkeys series was really entertaining, although I haven't watched it. And with that series, he didn't have huge budgets. Speaking of budgets, let's talk about how to design the series. These books are about, in mass market paperback, they're about like 600, almost 700 pages long. Let me check the hardcover, see how long the hardcover actually is. The hardcover is about just shy of 500 pages. So these aren't huge books like the Game of Thrones books, but there's so much plot and so many sequences that you'd have to adapt, because these are short chapters going from one thing to the next, and you're rotating between characters, and you'd have a lot of story in this 600 pages. I don't think a 10-episode series like they did for Game of Thrones is the wisest way to go. But I also don't think you should shrink it and do 4 or 6 episodes, because at that point you may as well have just made a long movie, a 3-hour movie. No, what I would suggest is to do an 8-episode season for this show, like they do for The Mandalorian, for Star Wars, and like they do for other sci-fi and fantasy projects. 8 episodes, I think, would be the sweet spot for this series. I think that you'd get all the story in, and I think that the audience would stick with it that long. Now, when it comes to budget, you can't go crazy, but you need to do it justice. So I think 10 to 15 million is the budget. You go more than 15 million, it's not worth it. The audience just isn't there. You go under 10 million on the budget, you cannot do the story justice. The only other way to do this for such a lower budget is to make it animated, which is a possibility, but would animation work for this kind of storytelling, which is very much adult storytelling? Animation works for adult humor situations, but an adult serious space opera, I just don't think works well in an animated series, which is why live action would work better. But I think that the fun of this story, the adventure, and the characters are strong enough that if you put it on like HBO, it would grow the audience like Game of Thrones did, and that not only would the book audience increase, but I think the show audience would grow to the point that by the end of the series, it would be popular. You'd probably be taking a loss on the first and maybe even second season. Of course, each season I would do a book, because that's how long they are. You may take a while to become profitable, but I think that by seasons 5, 6, and 7, you'd be making money because you've grown the audience if you've handled this correctly. So that's why I say 8-episode seasons, and you'd have 7 seasons. So it'd be like 56 episodes about. And I talked about the budget. This has a Game of Thrones style cast. I'm going to keep making those references because I think that's the best comparison you could make. And a lot of people just said, well, this is going to be the next Game of Thrones. Well, not really. This is the sci-fi Game of Thrones in terms of the scope and the characters and the cast and the political back and forths. It's not quite as graphic or has really the language of Game of Thrones, but it has the ideas of Game of Thrones, the backstabbing, the wars, the political grabs, all that stuff. And so that's why I keep making that reference. And so you'd need a sprawling cast. You might get one or two cast members that are A-list people, like how they got Sean Bean and Peter Dinklage were like the A-list stars that they got for Game of Thrones, and then everyone else was lesser-known stars that became big stars. That's what I would do with this series. The majority of the cast, like 95% of the cast, or even more than that, more like 99% of the cast, needs to be lesser-known actors. Maybe you get someone that you're like, oh, hey, I've seen them before, but you don't need big-name stars. But maybe for a few of the roles. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the character of Wenceslas, Chairman Wenceslas. I think you get a big-name actor to play him. I'm not exactly sure the actor you would get, but you get a big name actor for him, and then for the character, perhaps of some of the characters in the family that are the families that you see. I think that would be maybe one of the other kings, like King Peter. Maybe you'd get a big actor for that. But really, if you get Wenceslas as a huge actor, I think everyone else can be pretty small. And then finally, how would you release it? Do you release it as a binge series? I think that's a terrible model, terrible. Or do you do it as a weekly release? I think weekly release is probably the best option because these, I think, could be 40 minutes to an hour long, so it's a full episode. And I think that there's so much going on in them that you don't need to do multiple episodes during at once. You do one episode a week for 8 weeks. For 2 months, this becomes a big talked about show. This becomes the talked about show that everyone watches. Or the other option is to do 2 at a time, and so you release across 4 weeks, and you do 2 episodes a week for 4 weeks, 8 episodes, and you own that month. You make it Saga September, and that whole September you release the Saga of the Seven Sons, and it becomes just the dominating presence of 2-hour, basically a movie every week. Of this series. I don't think that's the best option. The best option is weekly, I think, but you could do 2 a week. But considering how HBO develops their projects, I think that if HBO took this, they do 1 a week. So that's why I'd go with that. So that's my general idea how I would adapt the Saga of the Seven Sons. And if it was successful, there's already a sequel series called The Saga of Shadows, which I think would be very popular afterwards. And knowing Kevin Anderson and his prolific ability to write books, he could write more books in this universe if he had a TV show behind it. So I think that's very much possible. So that is how I would adapt the Saga of the Seven Sons series. If you've read this book series, how would you adapt it? If you haven't read this book series, do you think it should be? Or what were your opinions? Leave all your opinions in the comments section down below. Please make sure to subscribe. I have lots of book-related videos and also some how I would adapt videos and other things like that. So please make sure to check out everything else on this channel and subscribe. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.